Los Angeles loves to pretend that its darkness is confined to movie screens. That violence is something you watch at a safe distance, wrapped in music and special effects. But on the morning of July 1st, 1981, a quiet house high up in Laurel Canyon showed just how real the horror could get. Police officers walked into a scene so brutal that seasoned detectives compared it to the Manson murders. Blood on the walls, bodies on the floor, skulls shattered by so many blows that it was hard to tell where one wound ended and another began. This is the story of that house, of the drug crew that lived there, the powerful dealer they robbed, the porn star who walked between both worlds, and a massacre that has never been fully solved. This is the real Wonderland Murders story. What they didn't tell you. The Wonderland House. Laurel Canyon's shadows. Laurel Canyon has two faces. By day, it looks like a winding, bohemian neighborhood in the Hollywood Hills. A place of trees, narrow streets, and houses perched above the city. In the 1960s and 70s, it was famous as a haven for musicians and artists. But by the early 1980s, another reputation had grown in the shadows. Drugs, dealers, and quiet houses that hid very loud secrets. At the top of one of those narrow roads sat a small rental home with a simple address, 8763 Wonderland Avenue. To most people, the house didn't look like the setting for a historic crime. It was cramped, a bit run down, just another place in the hills. But at night, neighbors saw the constant traffic, the shouting, the arguments, the cars coming and going at all hours. The house on Wonderland wasn't a home. It was a base of operations. The Wonderland Gang. Inside that house lived a loose crew of addicts and small-time criminals who would become known as the Wonderland Gang. There was Ron Launius, a veteran with a reputation for being violent, unpredictable, and dangerous. Billy Deverell, an older hustler who had been around the block more than once and knew how to survive in the drug world. Joy Miller, Deverell's girlfriend, who drifted in and out of the chaos of the house and the cocaine that fueled it. And there were others orbiting around this core. Girlfriends, friends, hangers-on, people who came to buy, to party, or to crash on a couch. From the outside, it looked like a never-ending party. On the inside, it was a mix of addiction, paranoia, and criminal opportunity. The Wonderland Gang's business was robbery. They stole from dealers, clients, anyone who looked like they had something worth taking. They weren't untouchable. They were reckless. And eventually, they chose the wrong target. Enter Eddie Nash. In the underworld of Los Angeles nightlife, one name carried real weight. Eddie Nash. Nash wasn't a street-level dealer. He was a nightclub owner, a man with money, connections, and a reputation for being both generous and terrifying. He had clubs, casinos, parties, and a steady flow of cocaine and other drugs. If you were a small crew of burglars and junkies in Laurel Canyon, robbing Eddie Nash was the kind of move that could change everything, for better or for much, much worse. The Wonderland crew knew this. They also knew that Nash's houses were filled with cash, drugs, and valuables. And somewhere along the way, a plan began to form. The robbery, a deal with a fallen star. To pull off a robbery like this, the gang needed information, someone who knew Nash's world from the inside. That's where John Holmes comes in. Once a famous porn star with a larger-than-life persona, by 1981, Holmes was a shadow of his former self. Addicted, desperate for drugs and money, he drifted between the orbit of Eddie Nash and the chaos of the Wonderland house. Holmes knew Nash. He knew the layout of Nash's home. He knew where the valuables were. According to many accounts, Holmes became the key that the Wonderland Gang needed. The idea was simple in theory and insane in practice. Holmes would go to Nash's house, unlock a door, or leave it unsecured, and later the Wonderland crew would storm in, posing as police or armed robbers, and clean the place out. For a group already living on the edge, this was the biggest score they had ever imagined. Setting up the score. In the days leading up to the robbery, Holmes moved between the two worlds, Nash's luxurious home and the grimy house on Wonderland. In one, he was a guest, someone who could still charm his way in. In the other, he was a go-between, promising access, promising riches, promising that this would be the big one. The Wonderland crew prepared as best they could, guns, masks, a rough plan for how to get in, how to control the situation, how to get out. But this wasn't a professional heist team. It was a group of addicts and small-time criminals about to poke a very dangerous bear. Once the plan was in motion, there was no way to walk it back. The Eddie Nash robbery. On the day of the robbery, Holmes allegedly did exactly what he'd promised. He made sure a door at Nash's home was open. Later, members of the Wonderland crew forced their way in. Some sources say pretending to be police officers. Others say simply storming the house. Inside, Nash and his bodyguard were overpowered. They were beaten, tied up, threatened. The crew took what they came for: cash, cocaine, jewelry, weapons. A haul worth a small fortune to people living from one fix to the next. They left Eddie Nash alive, but humiliated, injured, and furious. When you rob a dealer like Nash, you don't just take his property. You attack his reputation. You challenge his power. For men like that, revenge isn't a question of if, it's a question of how soon. A victory celebration. Back at 8763 Wonderland Avenue, the mood was electric. The stolen goods were laid out. Cocaine was cut and shared. Cash and valuables were divided. The Wonderland Gang believed they had pulled off the perfect job. They bragged. They partied. They treated the house like a victory parade ground, blind to the storm that was already heading straight for them. Somewhere out in the city, Eddie Nash was bleeding, furious, and asking questions. And it would not take him long to find the answers. The massacre. Retaliation is coming. You don't rob a powerful drug dealer without expecting consequences. According to later accounts, Nash quickly realized who had set him up and who had robbed him. He knew John Holmes. He knew where Holmes had been spending his time. At some point after the robbery, Holmes allegedly returned to Nash. Maybe for drugs, maybe because he thought he could talk his way out. Instead, he reportedly found himself in a very different role. Not a partner in crime, but a man under suspicion. Stories differ on exactly what happened next. Some say Holmes was beaten until he gave up the Wonderland crew. Others say he volunteered information to save himself. What remains constant in every version is this: someone led revenge back to Wonderland Avenue. The night before. The night of June 30th bleeds into the early morning of July 1st, 1981. Inside the house on Wonderland, it is another chaotic night. Drugs are being used. People drift in and out of consciousness. Arguments flare and fade. Some of the gang members may still believe they have gotten away with everything. Others might feel a creeping anxiety, a sense that they have awakened something they cannot control. Outside, the streets of Laurel Canyon are dark and quiet. Most of the neighbors are asleep. They are used to noise from that house. They have trained themselves to tune it out. They have no idea that within hours the property will become a crime scene unlike anything they've ever imagined. Enter the killers. In the early hours of July 1st, figures move toward the house on Wonderland Avenue. Whether John Holmes is with them, leading them, or arriving separately before or after, depends on which version of the story you believe. What is agreed upon is this: people entered that house with a purpose. They were not there to talk. They were not there to negotiate. They were there to send a message in blood. Inside, the victims were probably half asleep, high, or both. They would have had little time to understand what was happening. The attack, what happened next, was not a precise execution. It was rage, expressed through blunt force. The attackers used heavy objects, metal pipes, hammers, whatever they brought or found, to beat the occupants of the house. The blows were repeated, over and over, long past the point of simple killing. Skulls were smashed, bones were broken, blood splattered onto floors and walls. By the time it was over, 4 people lay dead or dying. A 5th would be left barely clinging to life. The killers walked out, leaving a house that looked less like a crime scene and more like a battlefield. In the stillness that followed, the only witnesses were the walls. A crime scene discovered. Here is one of the most chilling parts of the Wonderland story. The murders were not discovered right away. Neighbors heard noises, thuds, maybe even cries, but they were used to chaos at that address. For hours, the bodies lay where they had fallen. It wasn't until later that day that someone finally called the authorities. When officers entered 8763 Wonderland Avenue, they were confronted with a scene so brutal that it stayed with them for the rest of their careers. Photographs from that day would become infamous among true crime historians, circulated as some of the most graphic images in Los Angeles police files. The press quickly picked up on the story. A quadruple murder in a drug house in the Hollywood Hills, possibly tied to a powerful dealer and a fallen porn star. The stage was set for one of the strangest investigations in LA history. John Holmes and the aftermath. A bloody handprint. In the middle of the devastation, detectives found something that would make headlines for years. A bloody handprint on a piece of furniture near one of the bodies. That handprint belonged to John Holmes. The discovery instantly shifted the case from a gangland massacre to a tabloid-ready story involving sex, drugs, and Hollywood. Holmes was arrested and charged in connection with the murders. But was he one of the killers? Was he an unwilling participant? Or was he simply there before or after the attack? Those questions would haunt the investigation. The trial of John Holmes. In court, prosecutors painted Holmes as a key part of the plot. A man who had helped set up the robbery and then led Nash's men back to Wonderland for revenge. The defense countered that Holmes was a terrified addict, caught between a violent gang and a violent dealer, forced into the situation and too afraid to go to the police. The bloody handprint proved that Holmes had been at the scene, but it did not prove that he had swung a weapon. Witnesses changed stories. Motives were questioned. Everyone involved had something to hide. In the end, the jury was not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. John Holmes was acquitted of the Wonderland murders. Legally, he walked away a free man. But in the court of public opinion, the questions never stopped. Eddie Nash in the shadows. While Holmes faced the spotlight, another figure remained in the shadows, Eddie Nash. Investigators and journalists have long believed that Nash ordered the attack on Wonderland as payback for the robbery. Over the years, he would face various legal troubles connected to drugs, bribery, and the Wonderland case. But squeezing a clean, courtroom-ready story out of a world built on fear and silence proved difficult. Witnesses were unreliable, some were dead, others were too afraid to talk. Pieces of the puzzle surfaced, notes, testimonies, rumors. But the full picture never quite snapped into place. The official record remained frustratingly incomplete. A house with a memory. As time passed, the Wonderland case drifted into that eerie space between history and legend. The house on Wonderland Avenue changed hands, was remodeled, but never fully escaped its past. True crime writers, filmmakers, and locals whispered about it as a murder house, a place where the walls still remembered what happened. Tours pointed it out. Curious visitors drove up the canyon just to see the address for themselves. For people living nearby, it was a reminder that the glamorous hills above Los Angeles had their own share of nightmares. Unlike some cases with neat endings, the Wonderland murders refused to resolve themselves. No one would ever serve time for the 4 people killed that day. No judge would ever officially declare exactly who ordered what and who swung which weapon. The story remained fragmented, like a broken mirror. Hollywood's obsession. The Wonderland murders have never quite left the public imagination. They inspired books, documentaries, dramatic films, and series. Part of that fascination comes from the cast of characters. Addicts, thieves, a violent dealer, a former porn star once known the world over. Part comes from the savagery of the crime scene, so extreme that even hardened detectives struggled to describe it. And part comes from the unanswered questions. How much did John Holmes really know? Was he a mastermind, a pawn, or something in between? Who exactly walked into that house with weapons in hand? How high up did the order for revenge really go? Every new documentary, every new article, promises to solve the mystery. But the deeper you look, the more you realize how much of Wonderland is built on fear, lies, and self-preservation. What Wonderland really means. In the end, the Wonderland murders are not just a lurid story about drugs and gore in a Hollywood hillside house. They are a window into a specific moment in Los Angeles history, a time when the worlds of pornography, nightclubs, organized crime, and street-level addiction collided in brutal ways. The house at 8763 Wonderland Avenue was never truly a home. It was a crossroads for damaged people making desperate choices. The robbery of Eddie Nash was supposed to be a shortcut to easy money. Instead, it became a death sentence for almost everyone involved. Whether their bodies ended up on the floor that morning, or their lives slowly unraveled in the years that followed. Today, if you drive up Laurel Canyon and turn onto Wonderland Avenue, you might see a quiet residential street, neatly kept homes, cars parked along the curb. But hidden in those hills is the memory of a single house where greed, addiction, and revenge combined into something so violent that the city still speaks of it in a low voice. That is the real story of the Wonderland Murders. Not just who swung the weapon, but how a group of people step by step walked themselves into a massacre.